Homer, and he's going to be talking about researching historical records. I believe he has some expertise in that particular area, and I think this will be something interesting to maybe bring back in doing your own research or encouraging others in your lodge to do some research on the history and traditions of your lodge and especially the local area. Without further ado, Ray Cunningham.
All right, this is on. Can you hear me? What I'll do first, I'm going to pass out the 2-volume history of Homer, so you can take a look at it. Here's one of the volumes there. When we began writing this in 2005, we thought this was going to be a 200-page small book. It turned out that that wasn't the case at all. There's a bit of irony today in today's storm, because when this lodge was dedicated, they had a real cold and rainy day, and as the lodge members marched, they were cold and miserable by the time they came here. And it seemed that every time the lodge would do an event outdoors, the weather was really nasty. So, let's see. I don't know if you can see this. This is a picture of downtown Homer. It was taken from a grain elevator that used to sit right out here. And yeah, now you can see it a little better. That was taken in 1908. A little bit about me. I have a master's degree in history. I was trained at the LDS Genealogical Society. We took our master's class down there and learned historical research. One of the things that I specialize in is mass biographical historical method. Professionally, I'm a records manager. I'm a certified records manager and certified archivist. So I really like digging in old records. One of the best things I ever did was go to the attic of this building and take the historical records that were stuck up in the attic here. That has been a really fascinating dig into the history of this lodge. The lodge records upstairs went back to 1856, and so this is really an interesting lodge. Here we have this picture we found we didn't know much about, but we later learned that it was the Memorial Day exercise in 1884. The members of the Grand Army of the Republic, the veterans who came back from the Civil War, assembled, and that was how Memorial Day got started. Every Memorial Day in Homer, we go out and the Legion has a ceremony. That's been going on for many, many years. The Historical Society here formed in 1977. After the bicentennial, we got together. Quite interesting. Then they suggested that we write a history of Homer. I was horrified because the previous efforts were really not that good. And so I, having written on New England history, I moved here in 1999. And I said, well, I'll undertake this if you want. And so I wrote a chapter, I gave it to them. They were very enthusiastic. But they said, well, now we'll tell you the backstory about this and that. And so that really got the interest going. The first volume, we printed 500 copies. We sold out quickly. And then we realized people would be very interested in this. It is a little different because it's about the people and events. Some of them good, some of them bad. Some of them scandalous, some of them quite interesting. It's about quite a few things in our town. And you notice that it only goes up to 1980. There's a reason for that, because after 1980, the longest school strike in American history takes place in this town, as Sam knows. This was a real contentious time. And so while we have written volume 3, we have not published it yet. We're just waiting. What we're doing now is we're actually rewriting both volumes because everyone has been coming in over the years, bringing in new information, new photos and illustrations. We're going to put them together and make a larger volume. So we also now have the Luty Endowment for the Historical Society. We have $170,000 in the bank. We have a part-time researcher and employee. She's an archive student that I'm mentoring, and we're now getting our archives together and really recataloging everything. So we also have a research room in the Village Hall, and that's where our records are because they're better protected there. I practice microhistory. What I like to do is I like to really look at the minutia of what went on in a town. Who are the people in the 1800s that really made the town? The grand sweep of history is really derived from those small facts. And so you have to do detailed research to get into those facts and really figure it out on a real micro level. When I began the writing of Homer's history, I had a number of questions that I wanted to answer, and sat down with the group and said, all right, here's what we really have to answer. When did the first railroad arrive? They didn't know. They just assumed that, well, we knew it started here. No, that was not really true. I wanted to know what color it was. I wanted to know, was there a band, etc. When did the first automobile come to town? Nobody really knew. When did the interurban arrive? There was an interurban rail line that came from Ogden down to Homer. That many people remembered. Well, when did that start? Why did it start? Who owned the first automobile? That was actually pretty easy to find because at that time in 1906 everyone was proud of getting an automobile. When did the lights turn on? When did Homer's lights turn on? I want to know when they flipped the switch and had lights for the first time. And who placed the first telephone call? That is a little trickier because people were running lines between buildings very early. And I knew that I had done much of this also in New England for another town. Who's the most famous person to come from Homer? People are born here. Who is it? There's got to be someone. That was really puzzling too. What issue would anger people in Homer? What was it that got people to anger so that perhaps mob violence would start? It varies from community to community in history. I wrote my master's thesis on World War I. There was a lot of vigilante violence against German Americans in the western United States. And so I wanted to know in Homer what it was. Well, it didn't take long to find out. And what was the effect of technology on Homer? The rise of the automobile, how did this all come together? I was really very curious about that. In 1837, what we knew was the town was dragged from the Salt Fork. It was founded in 1837 and platted. 1855, the town was dragged down here. They literally dragged the buildings down here. We knew that. There were fires that ruined downtown. That what you see today is not what was once here. There were fires. And fires were typical in small towns. There were bank failures. The problem was that most people thought there was one bank failure, there were two, and they were mixing them up. So if you had an oral history, they talk about the bank failure, you'd have to discern what they were really talking about, which one. There was one in 1920 in the bank that was directly downstairs here, and there was one in 1932 just down the block. So which one were they talking about? The memories of the town went back to about 1920, and that was it. Then they really didn't know anything more than that. There were little snippets. I ignored all of it. I didn't care. I wanted to really just ignore it. We came back to it some years later to figure out what was going on. So how do you do this? How is it that you can do this? Well, first you have to create a timeline. When I was a grad student, we put them on note cards. We typed note cards, we would put the date on it and the event and some description, and then we'd have a bundle of note cards. Well, in the computer age, I don't want to do that. So I wanted to create a timeline of events, and I'll show you how to do that. Then a survey of resources. What were the national resources on Homer, this area, which is an area that I consider just to the west of the Wabash River, because that's really the economic driver in the early 1800s, and I had to consider that. What are the state resources? Now, I spent a lot of time in Springfield and had to go there to really tease out the records of what is going on in this area. So I had to figure that out as well. The county, the Urbana Archives has a lot of historical information, but what is really there? Also, Vermilion County. This was part of Vermilion County until 1833. So, some of it was sitting over in Danville. What we soon discovered was a lot of it was sitting in Danville. The economic impetus for Homer is Danville, and the trade was always that way. It was not to Urbana. So, my co-author, Molly Shove, she went to Danville every day and sat at the microfilm machines. I did the same in Urbana and then in Springfield. And we had to tease out what was there. Local resources. Many gifts had already been given to the Historical Society. There were a lot of manuscripts and papers, miscellaneous kinds of things. Minutes of the Masonic Lodge, minutes of the Grand Army of the Republic. There were the resources that the town had. They had the meeting minutes for the town back to 1868. So that gave us a lot of clues. So we also had to decide what we were going to do. In the old days, you just summarized things on a card. I was going to scan the pages, put them in, and put them in a database. Molly convinced me not to do that. She said, I will type them. Well, you can't. You don't know what we're up against. Yes, I'll type them. So I said, all right, that's probably the best thing to do because we don't know really what we're going to find. So we began to type all of this. We began a survey of going to every newspaper week by week, day by day, and looking to see what was there. That's insanity. We started about 2000, 2001. The first volume was done by 2005. It took an enormous amount of work. We just didn't realize what we would find at all. We had to learn the vocabulary of the 1800s. This is an example of that. This is a small article that appeared in a newspaper. Pearl Hollinsby, the Lafayette defaulter, is knitting stockings in the Indiana pen. I wonder if he won't send us a new pair for a Christmas present with pearl lining. I have no idea what that is. I have no idea what he's talking about. That is for Homer. It's in a paper. What does it mean? That lingered about 3 or 4 years until I found an entry in a paper in Fairmount that told me what this meant. Pearl Summers was a young lady who went around in the 1800s, and she went through every merchant in town breaking up their marriages. This man, he was in the penitentiary because he stole money to win her favor. She was the most beautiful woman in Homer. It was fit for a book. You could just write a book on this. And it took us years to figure out what people were talking about. Because in the local papers, they'll make little snide remarks, and you have no idea what they're speaking of. But what happens is what the local paper here will not tell you, the one in the next town will, because they're always dishing up gossip on what's happening in Homer. And so it's quite interesting how intertown rivals will reveal what is going on. So we had to learn all about what we were seeing. So this is what the timeline began to look like. And what we did was What we did was we used hypertext links to the articles, and what we would do is take the headline of the article and put them in, so that basically in a chronological order, all you did was click on it, and then it would go to the article, the full article. Now that's kind of insane, but over the years it begins to build up. So we went to all kinds of papers, I think in total probably 40. Again, there are big holes. The Homer Enterprise paper, we didn't have very many of them. But there were correspondents in Danville and Urbana that we could read. We could read what they were saying is going on in town. Now this is just an entry from 1853, 54, 55. That's what it looks like for those early papers in our chronology. If you go a little longer, you'll see this is 1887. This is only from January to March. We've got a lot of information. And also, in mapping it out, what we're doing is we are looking for holes. For example, I knew there was a 5-month hole in 1900 that I had nothing on. So I had to go to some other papers and read it. That's where we discovered when the hotel burned down. That was a mystery for many years. And finally, we found it by doing that. But this is extremely tedious, but it is really meticulous. And then from this, you can decide what's important and what's not. So we had a collection criteria. Well, what are you going to collect? What things are you going to collect? So I sat down with a board and went over what we were going to collect. Building and road construction, accidents. I like accidents. They're really interesting, and they tell you about technology and who's doing what. Yes, it's true. When women first drove cars, they were taking them through barns, they were taking them up on the sidewalk. It was really quite interesting how people learned to drive. They didn't. There were people who just presumed, well, I'm getting in a car, I'm going to get in a car and drive, right? It doesn't take anything. It really was quite funny at first. Weather. I like weather. Tornadoes, and actually it's interesting to chronicle all the tornadoes in this area and what they did and what people were doing. When people built on the edge of town and they built 2-story houses, lightning inevitably would hit them. And it was a really funny pattern. As people moved out to the west of town, there were no trees, and their houses would be hit by lightning. Lightning arrester salesman soon followed. Legal proceedings, school, social issues, alcohol, suffrage. I'm looking for anything. It's interesting that there's no mention of any kind of anti-slavery movement in Homer at all. They were concerned about preserving the Union. That's really one of the things they thought. Crime. I'm interested in crime. What are the patterns? What did they do about it? That's always fascinating. Minorities. I couldn't tell if any minorities lived in Homer at all until I started getting scrapbooks. And scrapbooks of families would have African Americans in it. But I didn't quite understand. So I went to the census records and started finding out of African Americans. This is the Broyles family. They lived in Homer. Their daughters went to the University of Illinois. This was taken in 1915. The first graduate, African American graduate at the University of Illinois was a Homer High graduate. We started to have to really look at this and figure it out. Personalities. Who are the personalities? What was happening previous to the Historical Society is they were writing about people who lived to be 90 years old, and they would tell the stories of what life was like before. Well, I'm more interested in personalities that are genuine, interesting characters that are inventing things. There are a lot of inventors that came from Homer. We didn't know anything about that. We went to the patent search and just pulled up everybody from Homer, Illinois, and it was quite interesting. There were a lot of them. Geography, again. Fairmount, we had to look at Fairmount. We had to look at Ogden. because burning corn was coming down in the wind on on the roofs of those houses. But this one is one of the papers we really wanted and finally found. In the 1970s, a box of glass negatives were found in a garage, in the top of a garage. And so the Historical Society worked to get these printed, and they were digitally scanned. Nobody knew what they were. They had no idea. But as we did our microhistory project, we figured out what they were. And it wasn't really too hard. In 2004, a box of 80 glass negatives were offered. They said they were from Allerton. We looked at the first few, knew they were not from Allerton, and said, yeah, we'll buy them. We purchased them. This photo is the dedication of the Methodist Church in 1902. And we knew these photos existed because you could read in the papers that a photographer was there, but it was frustrating because we didn't have the photos. This is a project we did at the Masonic Lodge. This is Willard Morrison, who passed on some years back. We came up and we imaged all the photos of the Masonic Lodge. And that was very helpful because there were a lot of people we didn't have photos of. So the biographical photos that are out, we did those. So what are the results? Well, I should show you that photo. That's this building here. That's when the bank, the Citizens Bank, was there. That was taken about 1910. So what are the results? The timeline, we have 30,000 news articles in this database that we can search. So no one tends to escape. I'm fascinated when we find something new that we didn't know about. We have 6,500 obituaries on people. We decided to type every obituary, and every time we would get another obituary of the same person, it would go in that obituary file. And we decided that we were searching down obituaries in Kansas, Nebraska, anybody who had lived here and moved on. We discovered a lot of fascinating things. We learned that a part of our photo collection was taken for the Danville Press Democrat by the photographer because he was the author of those articles. And so he'd go to a spot, take a picture, but it was not put in the newspaper. And so many of the photos, we know the exact date and time it was taken because it's an accident or something else that he was looking at. Many mysteries arose that took years to figure out. We changed our publication plans because we had a lot of material. And that was even, those books were even trimmed down. We have a lot of things we didn't put in them because we couldn't afford to put in them. So we published Volume 1 and Volume 2. And we stopped because of the school strike. Homer was a racially diverse community. We didn't realize this at all. There were Jewish activities, there were Jewish families who lived here and they had Jewish activities in the town. There were Jewish members of this lodge. We didn't know any of this. We had no idea. And then we started to figure it out. The largest farm in the United States was located in Broadlands from 1853. A man from Ohio came, opened the farm. It was the Sullivan Farm. It was massive. He brought in immigrant labor and worked it. It was a fascinating tale. Now, it answered why there really wasn't much settlement to the south of here, was because they only sold it off late. And many German immigrants then moved north, and that kind of also changed the complexion of Homer, a late wave of German immigration. Now, we also found out that Homer settled 2 other towns, Jerome, Idaho, and Ordway, Colorado. We started finding articles of so-and-so going to Jerome, so-and-so going to Ordway. We couldn't figure it out, so I go to Ordway, and I look at who's mayor, and it's a guy who was from the bank downstairs. And I'm thinking, what's going on? So we had to figure out, these were called Homer Colonies, and that's what they literally called them. A lot of people, when we post on Facebook and describe this, they say, oh, that's why my relatives moved to Idaho. I couldn't figure that out. But their towns are founded there. So we comb their cemeteries looking for them. The first settlers here were on the timber, and they were the Gentry Brothers. At the time, the only thing anybody knew was a man named Gentry built a cabin here. No, it was the brothers. The family itself helped me with their genealogy. They came up here to bring Grandma Gallion up here. And so we learned a bit about them, and Elizabeth Gentry is the first one born in the town in 1831. But again, there was really no town. They were squatters. They just came up for several seasons, built cabins, and then left. Moses Thomas built a mill on the Salt Fork. That was what became Homer. And Michael Coffeen came, saw the activity, saw the farmers, and he then decided to plat the town up at the Salt Fork in 1837. Now, what you should know, though, is that in 1837, they were also plotting to do rail lines. Yes, that early. Then there was a depression. They didn't do the rail lines until 1855. When they did that, the rail line from Danville to Springfield was going to bypass the town. And so they had to move the town. There are a couple towns in the United States that moved to meet the railway. This was one of them. So the town up there, up on the bluff, grew to 150 people with a post office, blacksmith shop, mill, and store. We learned quite a bit about that town and what went on there. And then the plan to move 32 buildings down here. They used 18 teams of oxen and they dragged them down. We found a narrative in a 1905 newspaper on the 50th anniversary that described exactly how they moved the town. And we really hadn't seen anything like that before. But the photographer went and interviewed the people who had done it. And it was stuck in an obscure newspaper in Danville. Homer and the Civil War. Homer raised two companies. They raised two companies, 200 boys. They wanted to get out of town, some of them would later say. But Homer offered a bounty, and they took it. So we collected people from all over. Now, other towns didn't do that. The provost marshal had to come and draft people. But Homer was not like that. Company F on the 26th, there were 21 pairs of brothers in that company. It is said that that was the largest number of brothers in a company in the Civil War. 1868 was, there are a few years, 1909, 1868, 1935, there are a few years in Homer's history that are really rough. 1868 was one of them. On March 16th, a tornado touched down the north side of town on 4th Street and wiped out a bunch of houses up there. There are a lot of descriptions of, there's one kid being pulled out of the rubble who is just saying, doggone, doggone, and they thought he was dead. They thought a lot of people had died in that, but no one did. But then the largest calamity to happen here was 18,000 cattle from Texas arrive in Tolono. What they do is they take them off at Tolono and they're moving them to Seidel, to cattle ranches over there. They're doing the Sullivan Ranch. They're dropping them off for to feed, fatten up to move to market in Chicago. They brought ticks. The ticks jump off, get on the other cattle. Every cow by August is dead. Every one of them. And at that time, you fed your family with a milk cow, that everyone had a milk cow in town. That set off vigilante action that occurred because they weren't letting any more cattle off. The cattle were literally dying out there at the same time, but they didn't know about ticks and disease. That was a major crisis. There's a lot of national literature on the Spanish cattle disease epidemic. So, I asked those questions. When did the first railroad arrive? December 1st, 1856. First automobile, 3:50 p.m., May 24th, 1896. That was a big event. The Mueller motorcycle came to town. They came from Decatur and drove it over to Danville and Indianapolis to have a race in Indianapolis. That was not the first, but they were building cars, entrepreneurs. The Mueller brothers in Decatur built this Mercedes-Benz vehicle and brought it through Homer. It was quite an event at the time. The Interurban arrived at midnight on May 25th, 1904. Ulysses Thompson owned the first Winton motor car, but of course, the Juergensmeyer family, they were wealthy in town too. They got one about 3 days later, but they were not first. The lights came on at 8 p.m. on May 11th, 1898. We were very early with lights. The merchants wanted street lights, so they put in a small power plant. That power plant grew to giving many of the towns around electrical service. That was quite fascinating. The first telephone call was from Ed Mudge at Mudge's Corner Drugstore to Smith France in Danville. And that was because a line was put in there. Again, they're kind of small lines that would go from grain elevator to the owner's house, but this is the first one. And then we have the second one, and there were people who were really skeptical about the telephone. Technology doesn't always do well. So what would anger people? What would get them mad? There was only one issue in this town: liquor, alcohol. This was a prohibition. We got liquor in 2006. Alcohol. The Women's Christian Temperance Union went out of business in about 1987. On December 21st, 1877, a mob of women, primarily women, descended on the blacksmith shop, Jim Umbenauer, destroying the crops of liquor. Jim Umbenauer was the constable for the town. It didn't matter. This followed weeks of urging at the pulpit. It was really quite sad. But that's what angers people. The most famous person is James Frank Hanley. He was governor of Indiana. We followed him from his childhood. And the problem that we would see is we'd see this guy, we didn't know who he was. Who is this guy? The last event you saw in 1877 of that, he was a boy at that time. His father was reputed to be an alcoholic. What he ran on was an anti-liquor. He was an anti-liquor candidate in 1905 in Indiana. And what eventually came of his career, he did one term. He was busting the saloons. But Hanley was the person that argued the Supreme Court. He became a lawyer. He argued in favor of prohibition, and in 1920 the Supreme Court allowed prohibition. The Volstead Act went through, but he was the primary mover. He was the head of the flying squadron and went from state to state trying to eliminate liquor in America. And the reason is he came from Homer, and the strife over liquor really impressed him. We have a complete biography that someone wrote of him that was never published. He died in 1920 in a rail accident. It was forgotten. No one ever knew about him. But he is the most famous person from Homer. It's really fascinating how we discovered this. We would see little snippets of him. Frank Hanley's in town. He's speaking at the Chautauqua. We didn't know who the guy was. And then I had to learn about that. What's the effect of technology in Homer? A lot of bad accidents. A lot of people died at the East Crossing here from trains, automobiles. Homer loved racing. They loved racing with horses. So it naturally translated into automobiles. North of town, everybody would race. Everybody was racing. By 1920, they're going and racing, and it's bad. And they can't stop it. Speeding was a big issue, but technology and cars, they all wanted to race cars. And so consequently, there were a lot of fatalities from automobiles. The interurban station, that's a picture of the interurban station. Homer Park, the amusement park, associated with interurbans. How do you get people out? Usually at the end of an interurban line, there was always an amusement park. Homer Park lasted until 1935. It was really an important park. Following the Civil War, World War I, we had a lot of young people who went to World War I. This is Frank Ernest, Homer High School, class of 15. He was going to the U of I. One of the columns is dedicated to him on the stadium. He's an African American. Joined the Army. He was killed in the Argonne Forest. He was Homer's first fatality. Really well regarded in this town. They really loved him. West Tibbetts. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was named after him because he carried the petitions to get rid of liquor in the town. University of Illinois student, worked as a bookkeeper. He was Golden Glove. He probably was one of Homer's best and brightest. He was killed in P-38 in World War II. Really a great guy. I knew his sister really well, and they just said the family was heartbroken over his loss. So we're currently reprocessing our collections, as I said. We're collecting anything that comes online. We're doing new newspapers all the time. We just got an acquisition of World War I letters this week. We're cataloging those. We continually work, and we collect current events. So if there's a problem or some issue here, we go and dig out and write about it. We photograph it and we write about it, because the newspapers don't cover things like they used to. And so we have to really look out for Homer's history today. So, questions?
So West Tibbetts was a member here.
Yes, he was.
And you'll see his name out here on the wall. There's World War II veterans listed in a picture frame. And there's two of them that got gold stars, and he's one of them. So his name still is here at Homer.
And West Tibbetts, as I said, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they named after him. And Frank Ernest, the VFW post in Urbana, the African American post, they named theirs after him. So,
I know it's a lot of work to catalog the town's history, and our lodge was originally in Chicago, and I know one of our earliest pieces that we have in our minutes is we are one of the few lodges that still have recorded minutes in Chicago from before the fire.
right.
And even the Valley of Chicago, our Scottish Rite, they're the original lodge profession and all that don't have their records because it was all lost, because that building was downtown. We were fortunate enough to be far enough south that we didn't say that, but there's still stuff that comes up. So how do you go about in a bigger town when there might have been like 200 Masonic lodges?
You've got to fill holes.
Yeah.
How do you fill holes? I know a lot of records are missing from what I need. How do I fill a hole? Well, I go to an adjacent set of records, see what's there, go to others, and I do what I call parallel. You've got to do parallel research in others to see what is there. It's very hard for Masonic lodges because, the minutes are gone. What are you really going to do? There was a fire in the post office here in 1957 that almost took this building. It got to it in time. Well, all the records were in the attic, and they could have been gone as well. What we saw, though, was in the newspapers. Anytime there was an event, we could see it. There actually was a lodge in Old Homer prior to this. We have the records from 1856 when they convened down here. We know nothing of what went on up there, except we know it existed. But I can't quite tell who transferred. I'm trying to get that, and that's the same thing I'm trying to do. I can't get prior to 56. There may be some other resources you can go to. Sometimes it's luck, and it just takes crazed persistence. Any other questions?
Does an average citizen have any problem getting the microfilm records that are stored in archives for community credentials or anything like
No.
that?
Generally not at all. No. The problem is operating the machines and having the wherewithal to sit there and look at it for hours.